Okay, hi, this is Elliot Fishman, and welcome to CTisus Facebook Live. I just want to say hi to everybody and welcome all of you to our latest meeting today. Today I'm going to speak about the adrenal gland. Hope everybody's doing well. First of all, today's September 30th. Today's the last day of September, so tomorrow's October. It was a pretty September in terms of weather, at least in this part of the country. I know many of you, if you were in the South, had flooding from hurricanes, so we feel bad, and people out west had fires. On the East Coast, at least Baltimore and New York, for the most part, had pretty good weather. Um, I, I picked the adrenal gland to talk about today because I was on an advisory board about 2 weeks ago on the incidental adrenal mass, and I gave a talk on imaging the adrenal last week at a Hopkins course. So it made me think about the incidental adrenal mass and how we manage it. Now, if you look at how radiologists, what ACR and what radiologists typically think about of incidental adrenal masses, and what endocrinologists and their societies think, really is totally different. So let me give you that in a summary statement or a summary fact. If you pick up an adrenal lesion incidentally on CT and it measures under 4 centimeters, is well defined, and with or without contrast, its value is under 10 Hounsfield units, surely even closer to 0 or negative numbers, but even 10 Hounsfield units, that's an adrenal adenoma, okay? And we say adrenal adenoma, next case. Now, if a lesion measures over 10 and you only have non-contrast CT, let's say it measures 22, I had a case yesterday, I was showing conferences 22, then you would need to evaluate further because you can't assume it's an adenoma. Yes, it could be a lipid poor adenoma, but the case I showed in conference yesterday was 22 non-contrast, but actually was an atypical pheochromocytoma. So when you see 22 or over 10, I'll give you 11, I'll give you 12, but let's say over 15, surely over 20, you need to give IV contrast, scanning at 70 seconds and 15 minutes. You need to look at how intense the lesion is at 70 seconds. If it goes above 120, then it's a pheo. If it stays less than 100 and it washes out more than 60%, it's going to be an adenoma when you look back at 15 minutes. Obviously, other lesions under 4 cm, you can have ganglioneuromas. If you saw fat in the lesion, you can have a myelolipoma. You saw fat and punctate calcifications, myelolipoma. So there are a number of other things that can be. Not everything is an adenoma or cancer or pheo, but it's something, again, being practical about and thinking about in that direction. Now, that's the radiologist, 4 cm, so I got a 4 cm mass, measures 5 Hounsfield units, well defined, no known malignancy. Again, when you have a patient with malignancy, you're always more cautious. Radiologists say, no need for follow-up, next case. And if you look at the articles published, it showed that incidental adrenal lesions in a patient with no known malignancy, 100% of the time is benign. Someone also, Corwin, I think, wrote an article that showed if you had bilateral adrenal masses, well defined under 10 Hounsfield units, they were still, and no malignancy, they were still going to be benign. Okay, so that's kind of simple. But if you ask the endocrine societies and the endocrinologists, they say, wait a second. If you pick up an adrenal lesion, perhaps the patient has underlying endocrine abnormalities. Perhaps you're missing the opportunity to pick up a hyperaldosteroma, potentially a lesion that yields Cushing's, a whole bunch of possible things. Theoretically, a pheo. So what the Endocrine Society recommends, if you find an incidental adrenal lesion and it looks like an adenoma, but you can't tell from a radiology perspective, is that a functioning adenoma or not? Does the patient have some hypersecretion and something that's important to detect that you can manage the patient and the patient will do well? So that's kind of a very interesting way of thinking about things, because as a radiologist, we're saying an adenoma means benign, means no significance. The endocrine people are saying no, yes, it's an adenoma, but it doesn't mean it's not a hyperfunctioning adenoma, and you need to look further. You can't make the assumption. So that becomes a very, very interesting point. In this panel I was on, there was a lot of discussion. What should you say? A couple of the endocrinologists who are in private practice really made the point that if you see something, we should get a hormonal assay on the patients. Now, I said, well, that might be expensive. They go, nah, it's $50. I said, nothing's $50. And obviously, it's hundreds of dollars, maybe thousands of dollars. So I think that's something that you really need to think about with your endocrinologist. The other thing is, quite frankly, most patients don't have endocrinologists. If every person who had an incidental adrenal lesion had to go to an endocrinologist, there'd be like a 5-year wait for endocrinologists. So it's a little bit tricky as well. Again, going from what's theoretical to what's practical to what's realistic. So again, consider that as a thought process. So in terms of patients having any sort of symptoms, I think the clinician would have to really think, well, you saw adrenal adenoma, then perhaps, depending on the situation, maybe I should get adrenal hormonal levels, different things like that, do adrenal profile. Now it's interesting, again, that's going to depend on who the referring doctor is. Now, of course, endocrinologists always will say to get a workup, and the endocrinologists are great, but number of patients who go to endocrinologists typically have problems. So the routine incidental lesion with nothing tends not to get to the endocrinologist. So it's a little bit biased in your sample. We still, what do we do at Hopkins? I'll just say 4 cm, 3 cm, 2.5 cm lesion consists with adenoma. I don't say, and maybe you should say, correlate clinically and if warranted, advise a adrenal panel. But I don't say that. Perhaps you might. Perhaps you should consider it. And we'll see what happens, because there is this difference between radiology and endocrinology, what they're saying, and of course, we want to do the right thing. On the other hand, is if you, every time you pick up an incidental adrenal lesion, we said, remember that's up to 5% of the population, that means a couple times a day you're recommending an adrenal workup. That's very expensive and it's very, very complicated. I like John Biacchino, John's one of our senior techs. I can do 4 patients the time it takes to scan the adrenals. And that's because what John's referring to is when you do adrenal, you need a 15-minute delay. 15-minute delay, I can go get a cup of coffee, grill a steak, come back and get the 15-minute delay after the 70-second study. So that is a time sucker and the patients sleep on the table, but that is the way to evaluate the adrenal glands. John, you just need to get a cup of coffee while they're on the table and hopefully they won't escape till you come back. In terms of other incidental adrenal lesions, again, I try to be very careful, like we all do, looking at the lesions. If I see fat, particularly macroscopic fat, yes, you can see that in adrenal cortical carcinomas, but then the lesions are vascular, they're irregular. Typically, fat in a lesion is going to be a myelolipoma, okay? An adrenal myelolipoma, fat and punctate calcification is what you're typically going to see. The amount of fat will vary. Myelolipomas can be all fat or a little bit of fat. When it's all fat, it's easy. Sometimes there's fat and there's some swirly haziness, but that typically represents prior bleed. Sometimes you see little bits of fat and punctate calcification, and those lesions are larger. To me, that's great for adrenal myelolipoma. One thing to remember is adrenal myelolipomas can grow over time. So the fact it was 5 cm before and now it's 6, and it's 2 years ago, they can grow up to 5 millimeters a year. What can be confused with a myelolipoma? If you have one of these fat infiltrating myelolipomas and you don't see a capsule, you want to be careful because occasionally retroperitoneal liposarcomas can look very similar. When you have a myelolipoma, even when they're large, they don't really infiltrate the retroperitoneum. They tend to have a capsule. And when you look at coronal views, often the capsule is very easy to see. So you want to be very careful that you're not making mistakes and calling something that's not a myelolipoma. That's a rare thing. I have 1 or 2 really good examples of that. It's not something that happens all the time. and typically it's not going to be a problem. We talk about other lesions. There's a thing called a ganglioneuroma, which is a 3 to 5 centimeter lesion. It's relatively low density, not as low density as fluid. You can see that as a possibility. That's very rare. You could see hemangiomas, which are very vascular. They're also very rare. Pheochromocytomas, I mentioned, the majority enhance above 120, range from a centimeter to 20 centimeters. The smaller ones tend to be in patients with syndromic pheochromocytomas, but pheos classically are very vascular, though there are things like cystic pheochromocytomas, so you need to consider that possibility as well. Cystic pheos can be very large and look identical to cystic primary adrenal cortical carcinomas. So they're coming out, but without a hormonal basis or hypertension, it'd be very hard perhaps to separate those. So that's a pitfall. When you talk about metastasis to the adrenal, when they're from renal cell, it can be vascular. They can be large or small. They can be unilateral or bilateral. Remember, all the rules about incidental adrenal lesions say you have no known malignancy. When you have a known malignancy and you have a soft tissue mass in the adrenal, whether it's 1 centimeter or 10 centimeters, it's highly suspicious for Mets. Another thing you can see that I show in conference occasionally is lymphoma. Adrenal lymphoma typically is part of a lesion where you have multiple organs involved, liver, spleen, adenopathy. Occasionally you do see a lymphoma of the adrenal where the only thing is adrenal involvement. It's usually bilateral but can be unilateral. Can be very large but typically maintains those hamartoshon, those triangular shape for the adrenal gland, so that becomes very important. A lymphoma, often patients have fever or they have some other symptoms, but big masses, think about that possibility. Then of course, primary adrenal cortical carcinoma, big masses, but they range from 3 to 20 centimeters. Sometimes they're smaller. The smaller ones are the ones that tend to be functional, so that's something to remember. When most adrenal cortical carcinomas do enhance to some reasonable degree, they're somewhat vascular, they're somewhat necrotic, they have calcifications, so that typically is not going to be a problem. When you do adrenal cortical carcinomas, you look for vascular invasion. They're usually unilateral. You look for liver mets. You look for local extension. Typical management is surgery followed by mitotane, which is a very toxic chemotherapy, but it's the only thing around. Survival from primary adrenal cortical carcinoma is relatively low because the tumors typically extend beyond the capsule and seed, and there's no really good chemotherapy for primary adrenal cortical carcinomas. Now there are other lesions I could talk about: adrenal cysts, old adrenal hemorrhage or adrenal hemorrhage in general, high density when it's acute, like from trauma or from Coumadin, haziness around the adrenal. When they're old hematomas, adrenal can be cystic with calcification around the rim, or the adrenal can be small. You maintain the limbs in calcification. In that scenario, the small adrenals look very much like TB or histo, where the adrenals are really small and calcified. Most of the time I see dense calcification over a cystic lesion. That's an old hematoma. Acute hematomas can be kind of tricky, and sometimes subacute, big mass of the adrenal doesn't enhance, but it's big, it's solid, doesn't wash out. Could it be a carcinoma? Sure, you kind of know it's something that looks bad. Invariably they'll get it removed, but it's so round and well defined, you'll need at least to think about that possibility. I've seen a couple hematomas, big masses in adrenal adenomas. I've seen hematomas in patients with myelolipoma, not a surprise. So it can be somewhat challenging, but I've seen a beautiful case of a 10.5 centimeter adrenal adenoma that was high density or relatively high density, but I didn't know what it was, and it was removed. Pathology showed that it was an adrenal adenoma that had bled. So it's something to think about. Now let's see. I'm running near the end of my time, so let's see. Hey, Liliana. Liliana's, when you hit her profile, she's married. I knew that, and she's from Barcelona, Spain. Okay. John Biacchino, he works at Johns Hopkins and studied at NYCC. You learn a lot about people. Madverna Upahaya is from Barihawa and has 551 friends. He does ask the question, can adrenal adenomas have cystic areas? The answer is yes. I mean, adenomas typically we like to say are homogeneous, but they don't have to be homogeneous. They can have cystic regions or more lower density. People talk about collision tumors where there's an adenoma as well as a cyst together. Also, at times when you have adenomas, they can previously have bled, so you might have some cystic components. So the answer is adenomas can have cystic areas, but when I start seeing cystic areas in a lesion, I'm really careful to look and make sure I'm not missing something else. Now, we do have some new talks on the adrenal, particularly large masses, on CTisus. I'm working on some other talks, like maybe this weekend I'll do them, so they'll be coming out the end of this year. We're kind of ramping up to finish the end of the year talks. Remember, I always have to do the talks in advance so we can make sure they work well, and then we can post them and everything else. So I'm kind of working on that now. So if anyone has any questions that we can ask now, you can ask later. Again, I also ask people to tell us whether or not this is a good time for the talks. We could do it different times. Obviously, the big advantage of being on the talk when I'm speaking to you is you're speaking to me live, and you can ask questions. You can always put comments down. I look at the comments. If there's questions, I do answer them. So whether you're here live or you're here 3 weeks later, we try to answer the questions. So that does work out. So with that, Liliana, catch you later. John, catch you later. Mataverta, catch you later as well. And I hope you have a great day, and we'll see you soon. Bye.